Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is an incredibly social art.
Open source is innovation.
Open source is enabling.
Open source is community.
And open source is weird.
Open source is incredibly important.
Open source is hard.
Open source is engaging.
Open source is collaboration.
Open source is like running the show.
Open source is ubiquitous.
Open source is, well, my life.
And open source is not free.
Before we dive in, let me give you some important reminders. People on the podcast participate as individuals. They do not represent any company or organization. All the thoughts and opinions are theirs. People share their stories and experiences, the way how they went through them and how they remember them, and reflect how those experiences affected their lives, influenced their decisions and their careers back then or ever since.
Welcome to the My Open Source Experience podcast. On today's episode, Phil and I are talking to Stefano Maffulli, and we're covering open source licenses, something that we should all understand deeply. However, there are a lot of confusions floating around in the industry. So we will cover challenges, good and bad practices, and the evolution of open source licenses. Enjoy the show.
Stefano, can you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background. What do you do right now in tech?
Of course. Hi, yeah, it's great to be here. I've been in free software and open source for a long time. When I graduated from college, I started using a computer. I studied architecture, so buildings and urban planning, rather than software engineering. I wasn't doing much programming at all. Or at all, actually. So I just was in front of a computer long for many hours, and it was always complicated to acquire licenses for AutoCAD or Esri, ArcInfo, and even after the complicated process of working with procurement at university and getting the packages, it was always painful to make the programs that they came in a box, make them do what we were supposed to be doing as researchers and newly graduated architects. So I thought that there had to be a better way. And before I graduated, I had a friend of mine who mentioned this Linux thing, and at the time I tried to use it, but I gave up because it was really complicated for me, too complicated, and I still didn't find Windows any more friendly or usable. But still, I was stuck with it. It was the professional thing that you were supposed to know how to use. Anyway, spending a lot of time with the software was complicated, and I ended up by chance discovering the GNU Manifesto and the GNU project, and that kind of a light bulb went off, and it's like, well, this looks more like the kind of science, the kind of teaching that I have received. You don't start from scratch all the time. One of my early lecturers in architecture was professor of technology, who told us, you young students, you are not going to be, you need to be filling up your brain with what the elders have been doing. Like, walk around the town, walk around the city of Florence, try to see how other buildings have been build on top of that. Like, don't try to reinvent the wheel, because it's really not worth it. So that was my first exposure to free software and open source at the time. I found that very fascinating. So I started advocating for it and started putting more knowledge and more efforts into running Linux at that point, because I thought it was the right way to do it, the right way to do computing. And long story short, I ended up running the open source initiative as the executive director a few decades after that.
Do you feel that your background in like architecture, when it comes to buildings, and you mentioned urban architecture, do you think that helped or shaped or influenced how you were thinking about software and the tech industry and ecosystem?
Absolutely. I've been doing so much of the training in multidisciplinary environments, like working with social scientists, statisticians, engineers, like building engineers, civil engineers, and computer scientists too, to progress, to learn how to do things. Urban planning, especially, it's such a social discipline, so tied to social discipline, and this multidisciplinary approach has followed me in all of my career, like from the initial years where I was advocating for open source and free software with the Free Software Foundation Europe and Italy, to managing communities later on with companies and nonprofit organizations like the OpenStack Foundation and other groups like Funamble and Rackspace and Twitter, like many different companies that I've worked with. I've always carried that approach of trying to understand everyone, talking and trying to get into the heads of every stakeholder.
Say that I'm smiling so much because we talked to Christy Nicola and he wanted to be an architect. I also wanted to be an architect, and then I ended up in IT, and both Christy and I kind of enjoy this community building and community architecture and governance and those kind of things. So to me personally, it's just so interesting to learn about everyone's career path and how these different segments that have nothing to do with tech still influence us very, very strongly.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, right? I mean, urban planning is a function of community building, right? I mean, that's literally what you're doing at a physical level. Maybe talk a little bit about your joining and taking the role of executive director at the Open Source Initiative. And how do you think things at the OSI have changed since you've started there?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, the OSI is a 25 years old organization, but it's been through multiple iterations already. I joined a little over 2 years ago, and as the first executive director. So things that have changed since I started is that we now have an executive director and we have a board that is now functioning more as a board instead of being the group of volunteers that were doing the work. Before I joined, the board members were active, and they were setting agendas and they were running projects. Right now it's different. We have staff, and staff sets priority with the board, and then we execute with board supervision. Although the board, it's not fully only a supervisor board, but it's going into that direction. They're taking that role. What else has changed? We formalized our programs. So we now have formal activities and responsibilities within our team. One of the programs is the historic one, where we look at licenses, we review licenses, we maintain the list of approved licenses. And then we have added to that program also a project called Clearly Defined, which is a metadata of a layer of improvement of information about licenses for individual packages inside the NPM or PyPy, Maven. Many of the packages inside those distributions they don't have the right information, or they're missing information about licenses. So Clearly Defined helps compliance managers to have a full view of what they're actually shipping to customers. The new program that we started is the policy program, which was already active. We had Simon Phipps taking care of overseeing the development of new standards and somewhat paying attention to policies. But during the past year, year and a half, 2 years, with his priorities, they've shifted. So he's looking more at the policy and some oversight over the development and standards. And we added Deb Bryant with more responsibility on the U.S. front, similar responsibility, watching the development of new policies in the United States and come up with positions and educating the policymakers. And the third program is advocacy and outreach. On this program front, we do organize conferences, but in this bucket, we're also looking at what's happening with in the AI context, in the artificial intelligence, machine learning, because this is something that I've been really concerned about. Before I joined the open source initiative, I've always been a promoter of free software and open source. I've been watching the organizations in the space and hoping that someone would pay attention and do more about when the mobile phone, the iPhone was launched, and when AWS was launched. Both of these, I saw those two new technologies, and I thought that I had this impression that they were both affecting some very fundamental components of the open source definition and the free software definition. Distribution of software changed radically. The concept of execution of software also changed. I was thinking of the applications that you have, the modern applications where you snap a picture on your phone. Your picture is not simply stored on your phone. It's uploaded on some system, and that system identifies, red eyes or other imperfections, fixes that for you and sends you back the picture. So, in this space, for me, there was a new way. I couldn't really understand exactly what were my rights. What's the source code that I need to ask for? Should I? Is there such a thing? Can I exercise any of my rights that I was supposed to be able to exercise? The right to study that system, that software, that modify it, copy, and run it for any purpose. Like, can I do any of that? And how do I exercise those rights? I didn't know, and I thought that there was something missing. The organizations, the Free Software Foundation, the Open Source Initiative, were not paying attention. And that's how I pitched it to. I made the pitch to the board when I was being hired. Now there is AI coming, and if we miss also this AI is changing the boundaries between data and software. Like at one point, they're just a very, very visible thing. And if we miss this revolution too, like if we miss this innovation, having an understanding of what users need to be, what rights they need to be demanding and how they can exercise them. If we don't have that conversation, we're going to be irrelevant within a few years. And that's how I got the job, I think. Yeah, we started looking at AI straight on immediately. That was took a little bit of convincing the rest of the board, but the AI space is really fascinating for me. It's really introducing new artifacts, and it sounds to me exactly the same. We are as a society at the same time, at the same space, very similar to when software first emerged as a new artifact of human creation. In the late 70s, for the first time, software started to be portable. You started to be moving it from one machine to another, same source code. You just recompile it and run it on another machine. Wow, what are we going to do with this thing? With what kind of law do we need to apply? What kind of legal frameworks? And copyright started to emerge, right? And the GNU community started to say, wait a second, if we copyright everything and privatize, and every PhD cycle, we have to start all over again, because whoever finishes their PhD, they're going to start a company. And that's what was happening. So they start a company, privatize their research, and boom, start from scratch all the time. Or you need to ask permissions all the time. Can I use your results of your PhD? May I? And that, would have stopped the evolution of computer science if that was going to be the case. If Richard Stallman, and we need to give credit to the man, if Richard was not so fixated and adamant about, no, this is the wrong way to go, looking backwards, I don't think that software and computer science would have evolved so quickly. It would probably be standing really way behind. And instead, with these principles enabled of low friction, no friction, permissionless ecosystem, that's how science has evolved, and a whole ecosystem has been created. We are in a similar time, because when I look at deep learning, machine learning, these neural network, these advanced neural network, they're creating new artifacts too, the models, the weights, the hyperparameters, all these new things. We don't know exactly what kind of legal frameworks apply to them. Some people are saying they're not even copyrightable. So if they're not copyrightable, then what do we have? Do we protect them? Do we have to? Well, probably not, but hopefully not. But we need to have that conversation, and we need to have it now.
You said something that kind of makes me ponder. I mean, in my perspective, the introduction of the iPhone, the rise of cloud services like AWS, those took off. I think the iPhone was introduced in 2007. I was right at also when the GPL v3 was created. The Affero, I think, came in 2008 as licenses to attempt to address things like cloud services in this different model. And those licenses haven't really caught on, except in the interesting case of trying to create an arduous commercial unfriendly license that would then be push organizations into a commercial license, right? I mean, do you think that was a success in what it was doing, or do you think it's, maybe talk a little bit about why you think it did or didn't get the uptake that folks were expecting as that GPL evolved from 2 to 3? And similarly, I mean, you're in the interesting place of, again, trying to build governance and structure around the AI models, the inbound tools, the outbound tools. There's and of course the data. So maybe tell us a bit about your perspectives there and how you're trying to navigate that with AI.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think that at the time there has been way too much. There have been too much finger wagging and not enough listening. I think because copyleft, I think is a very important tool, and for preservation of the rights of the users. Mm-hmm. And I think that what happened in the past, that fortunately there was no one really redefining the concept of users as the new users were being added. As the internet exploded, as mobile phones started to become popular and going in everyone's pocket, the concept of user that Richard Stallman initially had was not the same. It started to change. And I don't think that there's been much of thinking and evolving to clarify what the concept of copyleft needed to become. I think also that there was a very strong antagonistic position between the Free Software Foundation and a lot of the corporations that were popularizing a lot of their code, and that has not aged well. Like you were saying, the copyleft, the only answer to copyleft, the copyleft answer to cloud and mobile has been the Affero GPL, which is which is a license that is extremely complicated. Google adamantly refused. The VCs who have, who are a part of this movement, are part of this ecosystem. You can't deny that, for as much as so many people don't like them, but they are part of it. And they have been reluctant to adopt it, or they never really understood it. Like, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened if the Free Software Foundation went on a tour to explain in Silicon Valley, to explain what the GPL does, what copyleft means, what kind of business models you can enable with GPL and the copyleft concepts, what the Affero GPL intention is. If they went on a tour, maybe on a listening tour, if not an explanation tour, maybe things would have been different, and not the default would not be Apache, just because it's easy to understand, and IBM uses it, so no one's been ever fired for picking IBM anyway.
Do you have experience working with a company, like just looking at the other side, like a company having to understand either GPL or any other license in the open source space, and just like both in terms of how to use software and contribute back with the different licenses, as well as maybe if they are open sourcing a project, like how to choose a license for it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been I've been doing those, having those conversations before, but I have worked at the company that was very popular before the iPhone came out. The company is called Funambul, and with Funambul, the code was always available under initially a GPL license, GPL v3, GPL v2, and then when the GPL v3 came out and the Affero GPL came out, then the CEO, and we had this conversation, immediately went for the Affero because it fit perfectly his purpose. The company was structured in with a very clean separation between community users and paying users. Community users were using the exact same code that the enterprise users were using. Simply, the enterprise users were just telecoms, and no telecom will ever. I mean, at the time, they just wanted to have a company behind them, a support contract, and strong SLAs and all of that fun stuff. So there was a very clear separation. The sales team was not going after the users on the forum. They were not interested. They just had a very precise target. And the Affero GPL v3 allowed for protection of all the copyright, forced every contribution to come back. They had no issue with Funambul had no issues with free riders or any of that. Actually, the let's call them free riders. They were supporting the brand, make it the project more popular. The software was also modular, so it allowed for integrations with other. The software was synchronizing contacts and calendars and pictures and email across multiple devices. So if you had a Nokia and a BlackBerry and an Ericsson phone, you could share the same contacts also on the desktop too. It was magic, right? With push notification too. It was just fantastic, and the integrations also made it so that it was super popular.
How do you see the evolution of the license landscape lately? Like with the new business source license, I think functional source license came out recently
source
too.
License, yeah. So I think this is part of the. I think. I mean, I may be wrong, but I think this is just the fact that we haven't spent enough time as communities, as open source experts, to teach others about the values of the open source, what it means to do that, to run that pip install, npm install, what have you, and what it means to have, and what it means to what options you have once you choose a license, what business options, business model options you have when you choose a license, because all those pieces are connected. If a lot of these companies, when I see them changing their license and the reasons for their explanations for changing their license, to me is part of that lack of understanding of initially from the beginning, right? The beginning, you know that your product is going to be served as a service. If you put all of your code into GitHub or somewhere public with a license that allows for anyone to pick it up and run their services, of course you will run into free riding issues. We as communities, open source communities, have not provided enough answers to that, enough knowledge. If you think about the fact that there is only one license that covers the space, the Apero GPL v3, that's partially why, I think it's a symptom, of why there is not enough knowledge in this space, not enough shared understanding of the space and solutions. Therefore, and so we could have done more. We could have done more of listening, and we could have done more providing alternative solutions and information. I think that there's still space to recover, though. There is still time to recover and to provide more of that. And I would love the OSI to do more into this space, because the part about education is important. Very few notice also. I mean, when you look at Sentry or that switched to they switched to the functional software license, but also any other package out there, you will notice that if you look at their software bill of material, they import a lot of packages that they haven't written. So and Sentry is good in that front, because Sentry pays back. Like, at least they have a program of distributing money to open source developers out there, individuals. But not many other companies do the same, and that also not enough, because if everyone switches to licenses that are, but it's good, it's semi-open source, unless you like to wear khaki pants, or unless you don't drink coffee, because we don't like coffee, right? You end up creating gated environments, not commons. And the gated environments require that in order to go from point A to point B, you have to ask for permission. And that becomes immediately unfeasible, destroys everything that we built very quickly.
Do you think it's the responsibility of open source foundations to do this type of education, or do you think that it's a broader responsibility than that?
No, well, okay. So we have 20 years to recover, at least 20 years to recover. Right? Too much time, for too long, the emphasis has been on licenses only. If it's licensed with, if the package is licensed with an open source approved license, then it's an open source package. Yes, and there is more. There is more, because from the license, we need to talk about business models. We need to talk about governance of projects. We need to talk about responsibilities that you have towards society, towards other developers, and all of that is interconnected. That piece of complexity, I think, has been lost, and many engineers who have they've been running without thinking about the responsibilities, without thinking about the quality of the product that they were releasing, or being forced to release quickly by some other obscure force. I'm not blaming developers in general, but there is push to deliver quickly, get a new feature out without thinking too much. So everyone has been assembling without assembling components, and without paying attention to the guy in Nebraska, right? And his needs or their needs. I think we need to seriously rethink, and I'm starting to get the sense that the CRA is forcing our hand. The CRA, the Executive Order on Cybersecurity in the United States, all of this pressure is bringing that, come to Jesus moment, right? We're gonna have to have that conversation, and the role of the foundation, I think, is crucial because of being a place where knowledge is embedded into their governance, into the people who work there, and then can spread out to the contributors.
Yeah, it's an interesting being inside of large organizations that are analyzing the open source that's coming in and the importance of something being defined by the open source initiative as being open source with the various principles of open. For a lot of organizations, it's the case that that's the difference between being able to do something as a developer or developer team and having to go engage sourcing, right? Or whatever your procurement organization is that has to go through the contractual, right? And that's, and it's very much a step function, right? You're either open source, and so you know what you're going to be able to do with that software and what obligations, right? I mean, certainly, there's, every open source program office has a tie to their internal legal counsel and their IP legal counsel as to what can and can't be done and how you want to do that. But when it's not open source, regardless of the new license or a traditional commercial license, it does trip over to sourcing, and so that's always very much a step function. And I think it gets even substantially more convoluted when we start having organizations using either the Affero GPL or using the business source license or what have you, and then adding these added caveats in a blog post that say, well, the license says this, but if you're doing this, that, or the other thing, it's actually okay with us, because those are the types of things that just muddy the waters even worse, right? Because then you can't even, you don't know from one management, all it takes is a new management to say, well, that blog post, we didn't really mean that. So we actually really do want to do what the license says. And that just creates all this confusion, right? And so, and it's confusing between, is this a sourcing thing? Do we need to just go commercial license and not have to deal with this ambiguity? Or is it an open source? I mean, how do you see those evolutions and how it's affecting the collaborative communities that actually, are the basis of open source?
It's bad, right? It's bad. I understand their needs. I understand their fear. I understand even at the generational level. Like sometimes I speak to, I'm with these AI conversations. I'm engaging with a lot of groups that are not developers. They come from other spaces, from the open knowledge or open science, open data, or not open at all. They're the Civil Liberties Union and other groups, and I've noticed a lot of the resistance against the big tech companies. Like when the open source started in 20 years ago, and the big promoter was Google, and it was a good thing. Like Google at the time was a savior. They were the bastion against Microsoft, against Oracle. They were helping. They understood open source, they were adopting it, and they were deploying it at scale, and we were all excited about it. And forward 20 years ago, the initial ones, they're millionaires, billionaires. And generationally, we also know, we also have noticed that the divide, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has expanded. There is less of this, the middle class. And all of this, to me, resonates as one possible explanation of this reluctance of this hate against whatever favors Google, whatever favors Bezos and Amazon as a resistance, right? This may not be the case for Sentry or for Elastic or any of these other companies but I can see a trend in here. There is a trend of resistance against the big corporations because they've been exploiting the labor, the work of many people. So maybe I'm bundling two different things into one group, but the end result is the same. There is resistance against the big tech corporations, and as my role is quite difficult in these cases because I understand the reasons for the hate. I understand, and I even find it justifiable. But at the same time, I know that the solution is not to change the open source definition, to add new licenses with these obstacles, because that will create the counter effect. Like it would make the large corporation even more powerful because they can afford to have legal processes go through the legal process. They can afford to rewrite some of the code, or even maintain a fork. They have. I mean, I talk about this with the data people quite a lot because there is a whole group of creators who are saying, well, I'm not going to give you permission to use my pictures or my art, my writing anymore, because I don't want to be exploited by Microsoft. And my reaction is, well, if you insist on expanding the scope and the reach of copyright to cover data mining, what you're implicitly saying is you're giving your 30 years of history is only proprietary to the companies that already have accumulated that. So the Google, the Microsoft, the Getty Images, the Adobe, and all the others, because they have we gave, as a society, we gave them all of our content, and now we're stuck.
Yeah, it's a complex world. You sit in a very interesting position.
Yeah, well, I find it fascinating. I'm having fun navigating these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, and I too can appreciate the situation that the smaller companies are in with exploits is probably a reasonable word. Just the ability for the large tech companies to use those innovative services and turn them into, again, something that can be monetized on their platforms. I really, really struggle with the changing the license, though, because you're somewhat making a contract with the rest of the world when you put something out, and then to turn around and say, yeah, no, we were just kidding. We want to go with this different model. That I have a hard time with. The bait and switch is not good for the community and the overall collaborative ecosystem either.
Yeah, there's got to be a better way, and I would love to have the resources at the OSI to help these conversation, to have this conversation in a safe space, because I think it's time we have it.
Do you see the negative effects of these kind of behaviors already?
I would expect no, not really. It's one of the fascinating things that I want to see. In fact, with the annual survey that we do with together with Perforce, this year, one of the questions was differentiating between OpenSearch and Elastic, and differentiating MongoDB and MongoDB compatible API storage service. So we can start monitoring whether people are switching to compatible systems. It's really complicated. The bait and switch is definitely a bad thing. The introduction of new licenses and is also confusing, because, like you were saying, Phil, it just confuses the lawyers and makes all more complicated than it should be. The advantage of the open source, if there is one, the main advantage is that self-sovereignty of developers over their technological choices. And if you remove that, then we're back to the age where you need to call a salesperson in order to do any business.
Yep, and the moats get formed, and the incumbents win. So
yeah.
I mean, when it comes to these license changes, sometimes I get to wonder if if it's about not understanding open source or like not being able to get the most out of open source, or it really is just because they can use open source as kind of a marketing campaign and have an open source license and then spread the word, show everybody what this tool and artifact is all about, and then when enough people know, then say that, okay, now we are switching to a different model because that's what our business is, and the whole charade just ends up being a very different, weird marketing campaign.
It's hard to tell. It's probably all of the above. It's wanting to exploit the popularity, the fast adoption, rapid adoption. You put your early code as a Apache license on GitHub, and if it's good, people will start flocking to it, going to it, and downloading it, and using it, and integrating. At some other times, and some founders I speak with, they went without thinking about the consequences. They seem pretty naive to me. Like, no, I don't know. My friends used the Apache, or my previous startup where I worked there, they were using Apache. I use Apache. Like, okay, have you thought about the fact that it can be incorporated in someone else's product and you don't see anything back? Like, if they're bigger than you, they can maintain the fork and they don't rely on you. Oh no, I haven't thought about that. I have had these conversations, and some other times it's just some other times it's just a pattern. Like Simon Phipps calls it the Wright's ratchet model, which is the sugar CRM model. Gain adoption, and after a while, when you need to clean up the books for one reason or another, you squeeze and change the license, change the availability to others, and start milking your users.
There are so many different people that you meet who have so many different, wildly different perspectives on what open source is, right? I recall having conversations with an individual who, defined his open source success by how many users were using his product. And it's like, you got a good product. That doesn't mean you're got a collaborative community or you're actually open source, or, what does that mean? And it's very similar to what you just said, right? Somebody learns from the last startup that that was the license they used. And so, yeah.
When it comes to the license space, as you talk to people, companies, organizations, do you have like a view on, I don't know, seeing the most common misunderstandings about how to build a business model and how to factor in the license, or misconceptions, or what people just kind of refuse to even try to understand?
Yeah, I think that the most common one that I see is the visceral reaction against the GPL or the free GPL. Like, I cannot do it's non-commercial. That's the biggest pushback, and that kind of makes me angry. It's not commercial. What do you mean? You cannot incorporate it without giving back? No, it forces me to do. It's viral. It attaches to everything that I see. We need more education. We need to do a little bit more. The Free Software Foundation used to have this. They still do. They have this FAQ document, but it's becoming longer and longer and longer. At this point, they should probably be investing into going in and talking to people, like proper training, because it is a complicated concept, and it's becoming more complex with the technological evolution. But it's still a very fundamental piece where you can do business with it. You don't have to open up everything that you have attached to that code, and it is something that empowers a lot of as users, a lot of the technology that we have right now. If we had a more powerful way of changing what runs in our TVs, what runs in our cars, and fix them, we would probably be in a much better place as a society. And in fact, I welcome, I'm watching with very much, a lot of interest what the Software Freedom Conservancy has been doing, suing Visio and in order to get more access to the source code that runs inside TVs.
Do you have any success stories saying that you worked with an organization as they were trying to figure out the landscape and they actually got it right?
Not yet. Not yet. I cannot disclose, but we try to help the corporations who end up, having to deal with complicated matters, and we try to help them. Maybe there is a case where we're not involved as an organization, but one recent discussion was a court that has confirmed that the being open source really means something, and calling your product open source when it's not using an open source approved license is false advertising. That case and that pronunciation from a judge was a pretty good success story for me.
Yeah, agreed. That was good to see. I mean, it's been part of the fabric, I would say, of many, many contracts since I was working at HP in the early 2000s, right? It's a common thing to say, you can do something as open source as defined by the OSI, right? The OSI is the organization that, if not legally, has the right, although it's more so than it used to be with that recent court decision. It's always been the de facto, at least in the organizations that I've been familiar with, that is the OSI is the organization that says what is open source and what isn't. And that delineation has been really important, like I said, because it means, can a developer use it, or do we have to go through procurement? And so it's baked into that fabric of the software supply chain and how modern software is written.
Can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and nothing to do with open source or licenses?
I'm learning how to fix outboard motors.
Excellent.
And how is that going?
It's good. It's good. Get your hands dirty and learn a new skill. It's like going back to the era when I was restoring a little motorcycle, very tiny, 50cc that you could turn it on with a pedaling. Yeah, very
Excellent.
tiny one.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments section of the platform where you're following the podcast. This season is full of very interesting topics. For instance, open source licenses, culture within communities as well as companies, mentorship programs, open source within companies, or in other words, why does HR have to know what free and open source software is? Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
That was my first experience.
Oh, I loved it. Y'all had me telling stories that I haven't even thought about. And
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
I will have coffee with the two of you any day for the rest of my life.